They called her too much, too big, too loud, too hard to hide, sold for a handful of supplies, cast out by her own tribe as a burden. The townsfolk stared, certain she would break under shame. But the cowboy who took her in saw what no one else did. The strength it takes to survive when the world wants you small. The prairie wind carried rumors as easily as dust. It was the kind of spring in Wyoming that felt more like late winter. Gray clouds stretched tight over empty grasslands, the earth still cracked from frost, hope as thin as the morning mist. At the edge of the trading post, a crowd gathered, drawn not by promise but by spectacle. They had come to see a girl be sold, and they weren't quiet about it. She stood beside the wagon, shoulders squared, thick dark hair falling in a tangled braid to the small of her back. Her dress was patched and faded but clean, her cheeks were flushed, her hands calloused, and her jaw set in a way that dared anyone to laugh at her. At her feet, a worn satchel bulged with everything she owned. Some in the crowd whispered, "Too fat for the hunting parties. Eats more than she's worth. No man would take her." She heard every word and let none of them move her. The chief who led her there avoided her eyes, busy haggling over beans and salt and a battered rifle. To him it was business. To her it was the end of belonging. No tears, she had run out of those weeks ago, after her own mother told her she was too heavy for luck to find her, that every step she took shook the world the wrong way. She learned not to beg. The first offer was a joke, a sack of flour and a promise to haul firewood. Even that got a laugh. Most men wouldn't meet her gaze. Most boys pointed and sneered. But at the back of the crowd, Will Harper watched. He was a cowboy with a reputation for taking in strays, broken horses, hungry dogs, the kinds of people nobody else wanted. He'd lost his own family to a fever 2 winters past, and since then the loneliness had grown roots in him. Will didn't see burden when he looked at the girl. He saw someone who stood taller every time she was pushed down. When the haggling stalled and the chief's patience wore thin, Will stepped forward, voice low but steady. "I'll take her," he said, "not as charity, not as rescue, but as a choice." The trade was made. No cheers, no goodbyes. As Will led her away from the post, the wind picked up, cool and sharp, but she didn't flinch. Behind them, the crowd's laughter faded. Ahead, only open sky. She didn't know what kind of life waited on the other side of shame, but for the first time, someone walked beside her, not in front, not behind. The road west of the trading post was little more than a rutted trail, lined with sagebrush and jagged stones. Will Harper led the way, boots crunching on gravel, reins in hand, the sun barely breaking through the low clouds. The girl, her name was Mara, though nobody had bothered to ask, walked beside him in silence. She kept her chin up, eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to look back at the settlement that had spat her out. Will glanced sideways at her, noticing how she limped ever so slightly on her left foot. Her dress was thin for the weather, and though she tried not to show it, her teeth chattered when the wind shifted. He stopped beside a patch of wild juniper, pulling a faded wool blanket from his saddlebag. "Here," he said, holding it out. "It'll cut the wind." Mara hesitated, then took the blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she managed, her voice low, almost wary. She expected a price for every kindness. Too many years had taught her that nothing came free. Will just nodded and started walking again, slower this time, matching her pace without comment. After an hour, the prairie opened to a shallow valley, grass dry and brittle beneath their boots. Will's ranch wasn't much to look at from a distance. A single low house of weathered timber, a sagging barn with missing shingles, a small corral where 2 horses nosed at patches of frozen earth. Smoke drifted from the chimney, thin and blue, in the pale afternoon air. Mara looked at the place and saw nothing of comfort, just another stop along a journey she hadn't chosen. Still, something in the set of Will's shoulders said he wasn't the kind of man to shout or strike without cause. He led her inside, boots thudding on the porch. The house was small but tidy, every object put in its place. A cast-iron stove radiated weak warmth. Will motioned to the single chair at the table. "Sit, I'll fix something hot." Mara did as she was told, clutching the blanket tighter. Her stomach rumbled, but she kept her eyes down, shoulders squared. bracing for whatever might come next. Will poured water into a battered kettle, set it over the flame, then rummaged for beans and a heel of bread. He moved quietly, never in a hurry, as if he'd lived alone long enough to get by without words. At last he set a bowl in front of her. Mara ate with small, careful bites. Will sat across from her, elbows on the table, watching but not judging. The silence was not heavy, only unfamiliar. Outside, a dog barked, sharp and short. Will stood, stepped to the window, then came back and poured himself coffee. "Tomorrow, I'll show you the place," he said. "Fences need mending, cows checked. It's not easy work, but it's honest." Mara nodded, uncertain. She was used to being given orders, not invitations. Her mind raced with memories of the camp, the laughter, the jokes about her size, the way she was called lazy or useless, even when she tried to help. The night they'd sold her, she'd overheard her aunt whisper, "She eats too much, brings bad luck." They'd handed her over to the trader for a handful of supplies, never meeting her eyes. Will didn't know any of this, but he could sense the hurt in her quiet. He didn't ask about her tribe or her past. Instead, he said, "You'll sleep in here, I'll take the porch. Lock the door if you want." He left her with the dog curled up at her feet, and she stared into the shadows until her eyes ached. That night, sleep came in fits. Each sound, the whistle of the wind, the creak of old wood, pulled her back to every place she'd been unwanted. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, and pressed her palm to the cold glass of the window. The land was silent, the frost silvering the grass, the world caught in that thin hour before anyone expected anything from her. She let herself hope for a moment, just a flicker, that maybe here things could be different. Maybe the man in the next room wasn't just waiting to turn on her too. Maybe she could build something of herself, besides a burden to be carried or a mouth to be fed. But even as the fire died down and the first light slipped through the cracks, a question gnawed at her. Would this place break her down like the last, or would she finally have a chance to prove them all wrong? As Will's footsteps sounded on the porch, Mara tightened the blanket around her and braced herself, because out here survival wasn't just about food or shelter, but about learning whether a stranger's kindness was real or just another kind of trade. And as the door creaked open, neither of them could know that everything about their lives was about to change. The next morning, the ranch was quiet except for the slow clatter of Will's boots and the faint hum of cattle somewhere beyond the frost-brushed fields. Mara lay awake in the cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds. No children giggling at her expense, no harsh voices calling her slow. Just the gentle crackle of the fire, and somewhere close, the heavy breathing of the ranch dog curled near her feet. Will tapped on the doorframe, pausing before entering. "You sleep at all?" he asked, his tone even, almost gruff but not unfriendly. Mara nodded. She sat up, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, unsure whether to meet his eyes or look away. Will didn't push. He set a mug of hot water with a little sugar in her hands. "Eat something, then I'll show you around." She drank slowly, savoring the warmth spreading through her chest. It was a small kindness, but after the way her own people had treated her, it felt almost foreign. After breakfast, Will led her outside. The ranch sprawled beneath a sky as clear and sharp as broken glass, dotted with winter clouds. Fence lines ran crooked into the distance, posts half buried in snow, and a battered red barn leaned against the wind. The air smelled of hay and earth, the sort of deep cold that seeps into bone. Mara squinted into the sunlight, her cheeks stinging. Will pointed to the paddock. "Cows are half wild. Don't get too close unless you're with me." He moved toward the barn, expecting her to follow. She did, stepping carefully, trying not to leave deep tracks in the mud. "You ever work with animals?" he asked over his shoulder. Mara shook her head. "Only chickens," she admitted, her voice soft, "and only when they let me." There was a trace of bitterness she couldn't quite hide. Will stopped, studying her for a moment. "Chickens bite," he said. "Cows don't, usually. They just run you over if you're not paying attention." The corners of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. Mara managed a small one in return. Inside the barn, the shadows were cool and thick. A calf watched her from a stall, ears twitching. Will handed her a brush. Start with this one. She's young, so she won't kick unless you scare her. Mara hesitated, then stepped closer. The calf's fur was rough, warm beneath her fingers. She brushed in slow strokes, careful, watching for any sign of trouble. Will leaned against the stall, arms crossed. "You're gentle," he observed. "Animals know when someone's got patience." Mara didn't answer, but the words settled in her chest. No one had ever called her patient. Back home, she was always slow or useless, her size a constant joke. Here, in the quiet of the barn, she could almost forget the names they called her. When she finished, Will handed her a pail. "Water trough needs filling, think you can manage?" She nodded, lifting the bucket. It was heavy, awkward, but she carried it to the pump, refusing to let herself quit. As the water sloshed and her arms ached, she focused on the task, on the simpler physical work that made her feel, for once, capable. The day wore on, the sun rising higher as they moved from chore to chore. Will rarely spoke unless there was something to be taught, but when Mara struggled, her grip slipping on the shovel or her breath coming hard in the cold, he offered quiet advice. "Rest a minute if you need to. No shame in it." By midday, she was exhausted. Her hands were raw, her shoulders aching, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel invisible. Will handed her a slice of bread and a piece of dried apple. They sat on the porch in silence, eating side by side. The dog napped at Mara's feet, twitching in some dream. After lunch, Will fetched a battered saddle from the barn and set it on the porch rail. "You ever ride?" Mara shook her head. "Never let me." Said I was too heavy. The words slipped out before she could swallow them. Will's brow furrowed. "That's a load of nonsense. Horse don't care about weight so much as how you sit." He motioned to her. "You want to learn?" Mara hesitated, heart pounding. "What if I fall?" Will shrugged. "Then you get up," I did. He led her to the corral, where a big bay mare stood chewing hay. "Her name's Juniper. She's steady." He showed Mara how to approach, how to stroke the mare's neck and let her sniff her palm. "Talk to her," Will instructed, "like you would a friend." Mara obeyed, murmuring softly, feeling the horse's breath on her skin. Her nerves eased bit by bit. With Will's guidance, she learned to lift her foot into the stirrup, swing herself up, settle into the saddle. She gripped the pommel, knuckles white. "You're all right," Will said. "Just breathe." The mare shifted but didn't bolt. Mara sat taller, surprise flickering through her. She felt strong, different. They circled the paddock, Will leading by the reins, offering gentle corrections. When they stopped, Mara slid down and stood shaking but grinning beside the horse. "You did good," Will said, voice low. "Takes guts to try something new." Mara looked at the ground, but this time she was smiling. No one had ever called her brave before. As dusk fell, the air turned bitter. Will built up the fire in the house, then set a bowl of stew on the table for Mara. She ate slowly, savoring every bite. That night, lying in bed, her muscles sore but her spirit lighter, Mara allowed herself a new thought. Maybe she could belong somewhere after all. Maybe the world was bigger than the words used to break her. But as sleep finally drifted in, a shadow lingered at the edge of her thoughts, a fear that her tribe's scorn might follow her, even here. Would this peace last, or was she only borrowed comfort before being cast out again? The answer, she sensed, would come soon enough. The next few days slipped by in a rhythm that Mara had never known before. Every morning, she rose to the soft grey light of dawn, pulled on the boots Will had given her, and trudged out to the barn. She learned to feed the chickens, gather eggs without cracking them, and toss hay to the cattle. The barn cat, skeptical at first, began to curl around her legs, meowing for scraps. Will watched from a distance, only stepping in when she looked uncertain. There was a peace in the work, a sense of purpose that crept in slowly, melting the old shame that had clung to her skin like mud. She was still bigger than any woman in the county, but here her strength meant something. She could carry water farther than Will's last ranch hand. She could haul feed bags, push open frozen gates, and sometimes even make Will smile. The ache in her arms each night was a good ache, the kind that promised tomorrow would come and she'd still be needed. Will was a quiet man, but he noticed things others missed. When Mara stumbled, he steadied her with a word instead of a hand, letting her find her balance. When she blushed after a small mistake, he said nothing at all, letting the silence settle like a warm coat. Once, he left a jar of honey on her pillow, a rare treat. "Good work deserves a reward," he said, as if it were obvious. One afternoon, as the sun dropped behind the hills, a rider appeared on the horizon, a stranger, silhouetted against the burning sky. Mara stiffened, fear knotting her stomach. Old instincts told her to shrink back, hide her face, but Will just nodded for her to stay close. He walked out to meet the visitor, his hand resting on his belt, not quite near his gun, but close enough. The rider was a white man, rough-shaven and broad, his jacket smeared with trail dust. He tipped his hat, eyes flicking to Mara before focusing on Will. "Evening, Harper. Heard you picked up some new help." Will's jaw tightened, but his tone stayed calm. "That's right. She's earning her keep." The man grinned, showing yellow teeth. "Funny how word travels. Some folks say you got yourself a wild one. Heard she came from the Cheyenne. Got sold for being too much to handle. That true?" Mara's cheeks burned, but Will didn't blink. "Don't care what they say in town. She does good work, that's all I know." The stranger shrugged, spitting into the dirt. "Just watch yourself. Don't want trouble with the tribes or the council. Fat girls get desperate, and sometimes..." The word stung, familiar as old wounds. Mara stared at her boots, fighting the urge to run. Will's voice was low, steel beneath the surface. "You got business. Say it. If not, move on." There was a long pause. The stranger looked Mara over, then laughed, mean and small. "No business, just passing by. Thought you'd want a warning." With that, he wheeled his horse and rode off, dust trailing behind him. As the sound faded, Will glanced at Mara. "Don't listen to them," he said. "People talk. It's all they know how to do." Mara nodded, but her hands trembled as she turned away. She went back to the barn, pretending to check on the calf, but her heart raced with old fear. Maybe peace was just an illusion, a bubble that could burst with a single word. That night, the wind howled against the windows. Mara lay awake, staring at the dark rafters, replaying every cruel name she'd ever been called. She remembered the sneers of her own people, the harsh laughter of her brothers, the way her mother looked through her as if she were nothing but air. Here, on the ranch, she had started to believe she could be more. But could that last? Would Will turn on her if things got hard? If the council sent word? If another stranger brought rumors from town? The next morning, she woke before dawn and went outside. The snow had fallen overnight, covering everything in a thick, silent shroud. Mara walked past the barn and into the pasture, letting the cold bite her cheeks. She needed to prove, to herself, if not to Will, that she could belong here, that she wasn't just a burden or a joke or a trade made out of pity. She saw Will already at the far fence, mending a broken rail. Without waiting to be called, she grabbed a hammer and trudged through the snow to help. He didn't say much, just handed her a plank and showed her where to hold it. The work was hard, the wind raw, but together they managed. When the fence was solid again, Will looked at her and nodded. "Couldn't have done it without you." Mara felt something shift inside, a fragile sense of pride. She smiled, real, unforced. For a moment, the words of the stranger faded. Here, with her boots in the mud and a smear of paint on her cheek, she belonged. But as they headed back to the house, Mara spotted movement near the tree line, a flash of color, the glint of metal. Someone was watching from the woods. Her heart skipped. Was it another rancher? Someone from the tribe? She stopped, straining to see through the snow, but the figure vanished before she could call out. She opened her mouth to warn Will, but hesitated. Should she speak? Would he believe her? Or would she sound paranoid, desperate for trouble that wasn't there? The question hung between them, heavy as the storm clouds gathering above. And just then, a distant howl echoed across the field. Half coyote, half something else. Mara's blood ran cold. Trouble, it seemed, was coming, whether she was ready or not. That night, Mara struggled to sleep. Every sound outside set her nerves on edge, the barn door creaking, the wind slipping through cracks in the window, the low rumble of distant thunder. She kept replaying the moment she'd seen the figure by the tree line, convinced it was more than just a trick of her imagination. Her hands gripped the quilt so tight her knuckles ached. Will, seated in the old armchair by the fire, polished his rifle methodically, gaze shifting to the door every so often. He noticed the way Mara's eyes darted to the window, the lines of fear etched deep in her face. "You're safe here," he said, voice low but unwavering. "This place, these walls, they're yours as much as mine." But she just nodded, doubt clinging stubborn as a shadow. She tried to tell herself that Will meant what he said, that this ranch was now her home, but home had always been a word that broke apart in her mouth. In her tribe, home was the place where she'd learned to disappear, to make herself small, to carry her weight as quietly as possible. Here, it was different, but the old habits ran deep. As midnight crept in, the wind picked up. Snow hammered the roof and the shutters rattled. Mara curled beneath her blanket, listening for hoofbeats, for voices, anything that might confirm the threat she felt in her bones. She slipped from bed, padded quietly to the window and peered into the blackness. Only the barn lantern burned, its pale glow painting the snow with long, trembling shadows. Suddenly, a dog barked, sharp, frantic. Another joined in. Mara's heart lurched. Will was up in an instant, already at the door. He motioned for Mara to stay inside, but she shook her head and followed, clutching her coat tight around her. Outside, the cold slapped her awake. The dogs raced along the fence, teeth bared and fur bristling. Will raised his lantern, sweeping it over the yard. Nothing. He called out, no answer. Then, just as Mara stepped off the porch, a voice cut through the darkness. "She's here, ain't she?" The accent was rough, familiar from the rider the day before. A figure stepped out from behind the haystack. Same broad-shouldered man, now with two others beside him, faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. The dogs growled, but one of the strangers tossed a stone, sending them yelping back. Will squared his shoulders, gun held but not raised. "This is private land. Move along." The leader smirked. "Not looking for trouble, Harper. Just come to collect what's owed." His eyes slid to Mara, lingering. "Her people want her back. Say she's theirs to do with as they please." Mara's breath caught. She took a step back, but Will didn't budge. "You set foot here again. You'll answer to me, not her tribe." He kept his voice steady, but Mara heard the tension, like a rope about to snap. One of the other men spat into the snow. "You think you can hide her forever? Folks around here don't take kindly to strangers. You're making enemies for nothing." Mara felt her throat close, memories of old betrayals flooding back. She'd been traded once already. What would stop Will from giving in if the threat got real enough? She tried to stand tall, but fear pressed on her chest. The men shifted, uncertain whether to push harder or back down. Will's stance was unyielding. He raised the rifle, not aiming, but making his intentions clear. "Last warning," he growled. "Leave. Now." For a heartbeat, Mara thought the men would rush them, 3 against 1, odds as old as the land itself. But the leader hesitated, eyeing Will, then Mara, then the ranch behind them. He finally spat again. "Not worth it tonight, but we'll be back, and next time maybe you won't be so lucky." The threat hung in the air, heavy as thunder. The men melted into the darkness. Mara stood frozen on the porch, breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Will watched until they were gone, then turned to her, eyes softening. "You all right?" She nodded, but she wasn't sure if it was true. Inside, Will stoked the fire back to life. Mara slumped into a chair, shivering from more than just the cold. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to bring trouble here." Will knelt beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "This is not your fault. You belong here. That's the end of it." But as the fire crackled, Mara's mind raced. The men would return. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name. Could she keep running forever? Was there any place where the past couldn't find her? She watched Will, strong and resolute, and wondered how far he would go to keep his promise, how far she'd have to go herself. She barely slept. The night dragged on, every minute stretched by fear, and just before dawn, As the sky turned from black to iron gray, Mara heard the unmistakable sound of hooves in the distance. Closer this time, slow and deliberate. She sat up, heart hammering, knowing the test she'd always feared was finally here, and this time, no one could face it for her. The morning was colorless, cold light spilling into the kitchen as Mara and Will moved through silent routines. Neither spoke of what had happened hours before, but the worry was in every movement, the way Will checked the windows twice before lighting the stove, the way Mara kept glancing at the battered shotgun hung by the door. Outside, the snow was trampled where the men had stood. Their tracks zigzagged toward the woods, clear as a challenge. Mara tried to help with chores, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs. But her hands shook, and the hens scattered at her touch. She felt exposed, every noise sharpening her nerves. Will worked beside her, quieter than usual. After a while, he stopped, resting his hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to prove anything," he said softly. "No one expects you to be made of stone." His words warmed her more than the weak sun. After breakfast, Will saddled his horse. "I'm going into town for supplies," he said. "You stay inside, lock the doors." Mara wanted to protest, to insist she could help, but she knew he was right. Alone, she watched him ride off down the frozen trail, his figure shrinking until he disappeared into the trees. The house felt different without him, empty, almost haunted. Mara kept herself busy, washing dishes, sweeping the floor, folding blankets, but every task seemed pointless with the threat lingering outside. She sat by the fire, knees drawn up, staring at the faded embroidery on her skirt. She wondered what the men would do if Will wasn't there. Would they break in? Would anyone in the town care if she vanished again? Memories pressed in, her tribe's council fires, the whispered insults, the way the other girls turned away from her in disgust. She remembered the last day in camp, when her uncle's wife handed her a bundle of clothes and told her to leave before the sun set. "No one wants trouble here," she'd said. "You bring too much." The shame had stayed with her, heavier than any blanket. Outside, the dogs barked again, sharp and sudden. Mara jumped up, heart pounding. She peered through the frost-covered glass. A rider was coming up the path, not Will, but a young boy, maybe 12 or 13, on a small, shaggy pony. He wore a battered hat and his cheeks were red with cold. Mara hesitated, but opened the door a crack. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of her. "You, Mara?" he asked, shivering. She nodded, wary. He glanced over his shoulder. "Will sent me. He said to tell you don't let anyone in, not even me, unless I say the word rooster. Understand?" Mara blinked. "Rooster, I understand." The boy tipped his hat. "He said he'll be back by sundown, but if you see anyone else before then, hide. Under the floorboards if you have to." She thanked him and he rode off, disappearing just as quickly as he'd come. Mara bolted the door, her anxiety rising. Hide under the floorboards. How bad was it in town? She searched the small pantry, eyes falling on the loose plank Will had once pointed out. "Safe place for valuables," he'd said. Now, it felt like her only refuge. She checked the rifle, her hands trembling. She'd never shot anything but tin cans back at the edge of her old village, and even then her aim was poor. But the weapon gave her comfort, a thin shield against her fear. The day crawled by. Shadows grew long, the silence broken only by the wind and the restless scratch of mice in the walls. Mara kept close to the window, watching for movement. She replayed the threats from the night before, the promise that they'd return, that she'd never truly be free. Each passing hour tightened the knot in her stomach. When dusk finally settled over the land, a fresh set of hoofprints appeared in the snow. Mara's breath caught. She crouched beside the window, peering out as two riders approached. Not Will. They stopped at the gate, dismounted, and began walking toward the porch. One knocked, heavy and slow. Mara's pulse thundered in her ears. She waited, silent, clutching the rifle. "We know you're in there," a voice called, mocking. "No sense hiding. Your cowboy's not coming back tonight." The doorknob rattled. Mara pressed her back against the wall, forcing herself to breathe. She remembered the boy's warning, "Don't answer, don't make a sound." The men circled the house, peering in windows, testing the shutters. One kicked the door, hard. "Open up, girl. Won't hurt you, much." They laughed, a mean, bitter sound. Mara slid quietly toward the pantry, prying up the loose plank and slipping beneath the floorboards, pulling the wood shut above her. Dust choked her nose, darkness pressing close. She listened to boots crunching above her, the men's voices muffled but angry. The door splintered with a loud crack, and Mara held her breath, praying they wouldn't find her hiding place. Then silence. Long, stretched, unbearable. A crash, then another. The sound of footsteps running, and a single gunshot splitting the quiet. Mara bit her lip, tears burning in her eyes. And then, suddenly, the unmistakable sound of Will's voice, shouting her name in the twilight, leaving her to wonder if he'd come in time, or if the men had already found what they came for. The chaos above the floorboards froze Mara in place. She barely dared to breathe, ears straining to separate each sound, the thunder of boots, angry shouts, the crash of overturned furniture. Will's voice, clear and raw, echoed through the little house. "You get away from here. I'm warning you." There was a scuffle. Then the harsh, panicked voice of one of the men. "We just want the girl. She don't belong out here, you know that. She'll bring you nothing but trouble. Will, let us take her, and you'll have peace." Will's reply was ice cold. "She stays." "Now get out before I change my mind about letting you leave with all your teeth." Mara squeezed her eyes shut, her heart beating so fast she thought it might shake the dust from the planks above her. She clutched the rifle tighter, wishing she had the courage to crawl out and stand by Will's side. But her limbs felt locked in place by a lifetime of being told to hide, to shrink, to disappear when danger came. Another crash, something heavy, maybe a chair, knocked over. One of the men snarled, "You're making a mistake. She's not worth it." A grunt, the sound of fists hitting flesh, and then a gunshot so close it made Mara's ears ring. She pressed her hands over her mouth, fighting the urge to scream. Then silence, thick and suffocating. Mara counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Was Will still standing? Was it over? Or was this just a pause before the worst began? A moment later, boots stomped across the kitchen. Someone kicked at the floorboards near her hiding spot. Mara stilled every muscle, praying the plank wouldn't give her away. Voices, lower now, breathless. "You shot me, you bastard. You're lucky I didn't do worse. Get out before I finish what I started." She heard the door slam open, then heavy footsteps retreating into the night. For several long moments, nothing moved. Only the hiss of the wind through the broken door and the distant sound of a horse galloping away. Will's voice, softer now, shook with something between relief and anger. "Mara, where are you?" She tried to answer, but her throat was too tight. Instead, she pounded once on the wood above her head. Will crossed the room quickly, his boots thudding, and she heard him pull at the loose plank. His face appeared above her, pale and streaked with sweat and blood. "You all right?" he asked, voice rough but gentle. She nodded, crawling up into the open, her arms shaking. The kitchen was a mess. Chairs overturned, a lamp smashed, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. Will was breathing hard, clutching his left arm where blood stained the sleeve. "You're hurt," she managed, her own voice barely above a whisper. Will shook his head, brushing off the injury. "It's nothing. Just a graze." He reached out, steadying her by the shoulders. "You did good. You stayed hidden, just like I asked." The relief in his eyes was unmistakable, but beneath it, Mara saw something else, fear. Not of her, not of the men, but of what this violence meant for both of them. They set about cleaning up the house, moving slowly, as if afraid the walls themselves might collapse from the aftershock. Mara bandaged Will's arm with strips torn from an old shirt. He winced, but smiled at her efforts, squeezing her hand in silent gratitude. When the work was done, they sat side by side on the floor, backs against the cold stone of the hearth. Will stared into the fire, jaw clenched. "This won't stop," he said quietly. "They'll come back, or send someone else. Folks around here don't forget what they see as an insult." His voice was tired, weighted by a history Mara only now began to understand. She wanted to ask what he would do next, but the question died on her lips. She remembered the fear in the men's eyes, the way they'd spoken about her as if she were nothing more than a problem to be traded or gotten rid of. The old pain flared up again, unwanted, too much, always the outsider. But Will turned, eyes softening. "I'm not sending you away. You hear me? I chose you, Mara. You stay as long as you want. Whatever comes, we'll face it." A wave of emotion crashed over her. Gratitude, relief, a new kind of hope mingled with fear. She nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the broken door. Will stood, dragging a table across to block the entrance for the night. "We'll fix it up in the morning," he said. "Tonight, we keep warm and keep watch." They curled up by the fire, sleep coming slowly, broken by every gust of wind and creak of the house. But even as exhaustion pulled at her, Mara found herself listening for the soft rhythm of Will's breathing, steady beside her. Yet in the shadows outside, another set of eyes watched the battered house, someone neither of them had seen, someone with their own reasons for hating outsiders. And before dawn, Mara would realize that the worst danger wasn't always the loudest one at the door. The next morning, Mara woke to a strange quiet. For a long moment, she lay still, watching the fire's last embers glow in the hearth and listening to the distant sound of cows lowing in the frosty dawn. The kitchen still bore the marks of last night's chaos, but sunlight spilled through the crooked door, painting everything gold and new. Will was gone, his spot by the fire empty but still warm. She sat up, wrapping herself in the patched quilt, feeling every bruise and ache in her body. Her thoughts ran wild, replaying the violence, the fear, the way Will had stood up for her. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen to fight for her, not out of obligation, but because he wanted her there. That idea, as strange as it was, settled in her chest, a small, steady flame. She rose and shuffled to the door. Will was outside, already at work, hammering a new board into place to cover the broken frame. His left arm moved stiffly, but he worked with determination, glancing up when he saw her. "Morning," he called, managing a crooked smile. "Sleep at all?" She shrugged, then nodded. "A little. Are you sure your arm's all right?" He grunted. "Hurts like the devil, but I've had worse." He set the hammer aside and leaned against the porch railing, looking out at the land stretching wide and cold in the morning light. "We'll need to get to town soon, get more supplies, but it's best we stay out of sight for a while." Mara nodded, glancing nervously at the woods beyond the pasture. The sense of being watched still clung to her, an itch she couldn't shake. "Do you think they'll come back?" Will didn't answer right away. He looked at her, measuring his words. "People around here, they remember grudges. But most men are cowards when daylight comes. If anyone does come, they'll be looking for trouble, not a fair fight." Mara stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the wind, the distant clatter of a loose gate, and the steady rhythmic pounding of Mara's heart. Just then, a movement at the edge of the woods caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a deer, but as she stared, a figure stepped into the open, a woman wrapped in a faded red shawl, her face sharp and watchful. She hesitated at the tree line, eyes fixed on the ranch house. Will tensed, his hand going to his belt. "Stay here," he murmured, stepping off the porch and crossing the yard. Mara watched as he approached the stranger, exchanging a few words too quiet to hear. The woman shook her head, clutching the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her expression was wary, but not afraid. She glanced past Will, eyes locking on Mara, then back at the house. After a moment, Will waved Mara over. "It's all right. Come here." Mara obeyed, pulling the quilt tighter around herself. As she drew near, the woman looked her up and down, her gaze lingering on Mara's face and her shape, the old wounds that were impossible to hide. "You're the girl from the North Camp," the woman said quietly, her voice rough but not unkind. "The one they called too wild, too much." She gave a crooked smile, sad but knowing. "I heard what they did." Mara braced herself for pity or judgment, but the woman only nodded. "I'm Annie. I live over the ridge. I know what it's like. Being sold, being marked. She glanced at Will. Word travels fast out here. You made enemies last night, but you also made friends you don't know yet. Will listened in silence, jaw set. Annie continued, I can help. Folks in town are already talking. There's a bounty for the girl, and some men are eager to collect it. She looked at Mara, her eyes steady. You have to decide quick. Run, hide, or stand your ground. A chill raced through Mara. She had never felt so exposed, so suddenly hunted, even here in this place that was supposed to be safe. I don't want to run, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm tired of hiding. Annie reached out, laying a warm, calloused hand on Mara's arm. Then you fight. But you do it smart. You'll need help. And you'll need friends. I know who you can trust and who you can't. Will nodded, glancing at Mara. Whatever you choose, I'm with you. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wood smoke and distant snow. Annie looked back toward the trees. I can bring supplies tonight. But you can't stay here forever. Sooner or later, they'll come for you. Mara looked at Will, then at Annie, and for the first time, she felt a surge of resolve. She wasn't just a burden anymore. She was part of this land, this fight, this story. As Annie melted back into the woods, Mara stood taller. She and Will began to board up the windows, moving with a quiet urgency, their hands working together in silent partnership. But as darkness crept across the ranch, a single gunshot echoed in the distance, closer than before, sharp and unmistakable, a warning that the world outside had not forgotten, and the real storm was only just beginning. That night, the ranch became a fortress. Will and Mara worked side by side, securing every window, checking the locks, even placing a makeshift bar across the front door, using a length of timber Will had been saving for repairs. Each task had a rhythm, Will's steady hands, Mara's cautious determination, the silence between them broken only by the dull thud of hammering and the sharp crackle of the fire. The sense of threat was no longer abstract. It pressed in on them, real and immediate, twisting the air in the cabin until every shadow seemed to move. Mara tried to focus on the small comforts, the warmth of the hearth, the simple meal Annie had brought, dried apples, salt pork, a flask of bitter tea. But even as she ate, her mind drifted to the distant woods, to the shot that had echoed across the hills. Do you think it was a warning? She asked, voice low. Will looked up, jaw tense. Could be. Or it could mean someone's already out there, scouting. Either way, we need to be ready. The minutes ticked by in uneasy quiet. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the eaves, scattering dry leaves across the porch. Mara watched Will clean his rifle by the lamplight, his movements methodical. For the first time, she realized how much she depended on him, not just for protection, but for the fragile sense of hope he seemed to carry, even now. She helped where she could, sharpening knives, sweeping up glass from the broken window. Each small act made her feel less like a burden, more like someone with a place and purpose. When she paused, staring into the fire, Will spoke softly. You did good today, Mara. I mean it, you didn't run. She blinked, surprised. No one had ever spoken to her that way. I'm tired of running, she said, almost to herself. The night deepened. Annie hadn't returned, and Mara's worry grew heavy. The lamp's glow flickered, throwing their shadows large against the walls. Mara wrapped herself in the old quilt and tried to rest, but sleep would not come. Instead, she listened to every creak, every gust of wind, every distant howl. Time lost its shape. Hours passed. Somewhere near midnight, Will rose quietly and stepped outside, rifle in hand. Mara sat up, her heart pounding. She moved to the window and watched as Will circled the house, checking the fence line, scanning the dark with slow, measured movements. The moon hung low, spilling silver across the yard, making every branch and rock look like a crouching figure. Suddenly, a whisper of movement at the edge of the trees caught Mara's eye. She pressed closer, breath fogging the glass. Someone, or something, was out there, moving just beyond the reach of moonlight. She saw the glint of metal, the flash of a coat as a figure ducked behind an old wagon at the far edge of the barn. "Will!" she hissed, flinging open the door just as he rounded the corner. He met her at a run, rifle up, his eyes scanning the yard. "Where?" he asked, voice tight. Mara pointed. "Near the barn, someone's hiding." Will didn't hesitate. He motioned her back inside, but Mara shook her head. "I'm not leaving you alone," she insisted, grabbing the old hatchet from beside the stove. Will hesitated, but saw the determination in her eyes. Together, they crept out into the cold, feet silent on the frosted grass. The night was sharp and electric with tension. Every sound was amplified: the crack of a twig, the distant call of a night bird, Mara's own breathing. They moved slowly toward the barn, sticking to the shadows. The smell of hay and cold earth filled Mara's nose. As they reached the side wall, Will held up a hand, signaling her to stop. He peered around the corner, then turned back, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay behind me." From the darkness near the wagon, a figure suddenly bolted upright. The moonlight caught his face. A young man, pale and nervous, holding something in his hand. He was alone, but not unarmed. "Don't shoot!" he called out, voice shaking. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." Will kept his rifle raised, "Then drop it and step out where I can see you." The stranger hesitated, then tossed a small knife into the dirt and raised his hands. "My name's Caleb. I was looking for Annie. She told me to come here if there was trouble. I didn't know who else to trust." Mara stepped out from behind Will, her grip on the hatchet loosening. "You know Annie," Caleb nodded, his breath coming fast. "She's my sister. She sent me to help. Said you'd need someone to watch the road. Someone who knows how these men think. They're already gathering in town." Will and Mara exchanged a glance. Caleb's arrival changed everything. An ally, but also a sign that danger was closer than they'd feared. Before anyone could speak again, a distant chilling sound shattered the stillness, the unmistakable thunder of hooves, many of them echoing across the frozen hills toward the ranch. Will's eyes narrowed. "Get inside, both of you, now." Mara felt the cold bite deep as she ran Caleb at her side. She realized with a shudder that whatever was coming, it would not be settled quietly. They had only minutes to prepare. And as the first dark shapes appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the moon, Mara knew the real test, the fight for everything she had begun to hope for, was about to begin. Inside, the cabin felt suddenly small. Caleb bolted the door behind them, face pale in the lamplight. Will crossed to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the boards. Mara's hands shook as she checked the hatchet, forcing herself to focus on its weight, the solid comfort of the handle. She could hear the distant rumble, hooves and voices, drawing closer with terrifying certainty. Will spoke, voice low and steady. "There's at least a dozen out there, some with torches. I count 2 rifles, maybe 3. They'll try to spook us out. If we stay calm, we have a chance." Mara's heart hammered. All her life, she'd been taught to stay out of the way, to keep quiet and not cause trouble. Now, everything depended on her refusing to disappear. She moved through the little kitchen, gathering anything that could serve as a weapon: a poker, a heavy iron pan, a carving knife, lining them up on the table with care. Caleb moved to help, loading the old revolver Annie kept hidden beneath the bread bin. The world outside had shrunk to the glow of the lamps and the thunder of hoofbeats drawing closer with each breath. Shadows shifted across the yard, and Mara caught glimpses of men, faces she'd seen in town, men who had jeered and spat at her at the market, now grim and silent as they rode in a loose half-circle around the house. A stone shattered the window over the sink, showering the counter with glass. Mara ducked, heart in her throat, as a rough voice called out, "Will, no one needs to get hurt. Just give her up. She's not worth dying for. Fat girls don't get to choose who keeps them." The words cut deeper than any weapon, but this time Mara felt only anger, sharp and clean, burning through her fear. Will stepped in front of her, voice ringing out, "You want trouble. You picked the wrong house. This is my ranch. She's my guest. You come through me, or you turn around." A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd outside. Another rock crashed against the door, splintering the wood. Caleb kept his back to the wall, pistol ready, his eyes never leaving the front window. Mara crouched beside the hearth, every muscle coiled, breath shallow but steady. Minutes dragged on. The voices outside grew louder, angrier, a drunken cacophony laced with threats. Someone tried to force the back door, rattling the latch hard enough to shake the hinges. Will motioned to Caleb, who crept to the back with the revolver. Mara found herself pressed flat against the wall, heart racing as footsteps crunched in the frost just outside. Suddenly, a torch arced through the air, landing in the yard, flames licking hungrily at the brittle grass. Smoke billowed up, thick and acrid. Will cursed under his breath, grabbing a bucket of water and dousing the flames before they could reach the porch. For a moment, it seemed like the attackers might rush the house, but they held back, wary of the rifles they knew were inside. Then a voice, louder than the rest, rang out from the darkness. "You can't hide forever, Will. She ain't one of us. She's nothing but trouble, and she'll bring more if you keep her. Give her up, and we'll leave you be." For a split second, the room went still. Mara felt every eye in the cabin turn to her. Her stomach twisted, a memory rising. Her own people, eyes full of pity and contempt, whispering about her size, her silence, her supposed uselessness. For so long, she'd believed them. But now, facing the hatred of men who didn't even know her, she felt something shift. She stood up, drawing herself to her full height, shoulders squared. "I'm not leaving," she said, voice trembling but clear. "Not for you, not for anyone. If you want me gone, you'll have to come through all of us." Caleb blinked in surprise. Will shot her a quick glance, pride flickering behind his worry. The attackers outside must have heard her voice. There was a stunned pause. Then another stone hit the door with a loud crack. A figure stepped forward into the torchlight. Tall, broad, a familiar face twisted with hate. It was Luther, the ranch hand who'd been fired the month before for drinking on the job. "You don't belong here," he shouted, raising a rifle. "Neither of you do. Last chance." Will didn't flinch. "You want to fight, Luther? Then step up. But I promise you'll regret it." The tension snapped like a wire. The crowd surged forward, voices rising. Someone fired a shot, the bullet slamming into the doorframe inches from Mara's head. She dropped to the floor, heart pounding. Caleb returned fire, shattering the lantern outside and plunging the yard into sudden darkness. Smoke thickened, men shouted and cursed, some retreating, others pushing closer. The door buckled as someone slammed against it with a boot, splinters flying. Will braced his shoulder to hold it closed, teeth gritted, muscles straining. Mara crawled to his side, hatchet in hand. Caleb moved to the window, taking careful aim. The night became a blur of noise, shouts, shots, pounding fists, the crash of breaking glass. But through it all, Mara felt a strange calm settle over her. For the first time, she was standing her ground, not just for herself, but for the family she had found. Outside, the attackers regrouped, gathering for one final push. Inside, Mara glanced at Will, meeting his eyes. They both knew, if help didn't come soon, this could be the end. And as the battering ram slammed into the door, splintering it wide, Mara tightened her grip and prepared for what might be the fight of her life. The battered door shuddered, hinges screeching, and then, with a final splintering crack, it gave way. Cold night air rushed in, followed by 3 men, Luther at the front, his face twisted with fury, 2 others behind, brandishing clubs and lanterns. The rest of the mob lingered in the yard, some emboldened by the breach, others hanging back, suddenly unsure now that bullets and blades replaced drunken threats. Will lunged to block Luther, swinging a heavy iron poker. The two crashed together, stumbling into the table and sending dishes flying. Mara barely had time to register the chaos before the second man grabbed her by the arm, yanking her toward the door. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she didn't scream. Instead, she twisted, bringing the hatchet up and striking his forearm hard enough to make him drop her with a howl. Behind her, Caleb fired a warning shot into the ceiling, wood chips raining down. "Back off!" he roared, voice hoarse with fear and rage. The attackers hesitated, staring at the shattered door, the armed men, and Mara, who now stood between them and the warmth of the hearth, blood on her knuckles and fire in her eyes. But Luther wasn't finished. He shoved Will aside, raising his rifle. "You're not welcome here. You never were." He aimed at Mara, not at Will. For a split second, the room froze, every heartbeat pounding in her ears. Will dove, knocking Luther's arm up just as the rifle went off. The bullet punched into the wall above Mara's head, showering her with splinters. She didn't hesitate. Hatchet in hand, she charged at Luther, driving her shoulder into his ribs and sending him crashing against the doorframe. The rifle clattered to the floor. Will moved in a flash, pinning Luther's arms as Mara kicked the weapon across the room. The other intruder lunged at Caleb, but Annie, silent until now, appeared from the back hall, wielding the iron skillet she'd kept hidden behind her skirts. She swung it with surprising strength, catching the attacker on the side of the head. He dropped, stunned, giving Caleb time to drag him away from the door. Outside, the mob's courage faltered. Someone shouted, "They're armed! Get out before the sheriff comes!" Panic rippled through the men on the porch. A few tossed their torches aside, turning to flee into the night, but not everyone left. Had a cluster, led by another rancher who'd always resented Will, surged forward, emboldened by numbers, rage, or simply too much whiskey. Mara moved to the threshold, blocking their way. Her voice rang out, stronger than she'd ever imagined, echoing through the chaos. "This isn't your home. I won't let you hurt anyone here." For a moment, the men hesitated. She could see the doubt flicker in their eyes, uncertain, faced with someone who should have been an easy victim, but now stood between them and what they thought was theirs by right. Then one of them, desperate, grabbed for her. Mara didn't flinch. She swung the hatchet, grazing his arm, making him fall back, cursing. Will appeared at her side, bleeding from a gash on his brow. "You don't belong here," the rancher spat. "Neither of you." Caleb, gun raised, cut in with a cold edge to his voice. "She belongs wherever she stands. You want trouble? You'll get it." Annie knelt beside the injured intruder, tying his hands with a torn sheet. "Sheriff's on his way," she lied loudly, hoping to push the attackers into retreat. The bluff worked. Fear overtook bravado as the mob realized they'd lost control. A shot rang out in the darkness, this time from the yard. Mara flinched, but no one inside was hit. The crowd outside began to scatter, boots thundering across the yard, curses fading into the night. Luther, pinned beneath Will's knee, howled and thrashed, but Mara stood over him, her shadow tall in the lamplight. For the first time, she saw real fear in his eyes. "You could have let them take me," she said, voice shaking but steady. "But you didn't. And now neither will I." The night's violence began to ebb, replaced by a tense silence. Will released Luther, shoving him out the broken door. "You come back, you'll answer to all of us." As the last of the attackers fled, Mara collapsed to her knees, trembling. Caleb pulled her up, hugging her fiercely. "You did it," he murmured. "You really did." But before anyone could celebrate, a harsh voice shouted from the shadows, "It's not over. You hear me?" "This ain't the end." Luther's threat echoed, promising trouble would return with dawn. Mara met his glare with her own. She no longer shrank from it. The battered family closed ranks around her. Will, bloodied but proud. Annie, fierce. Caleb's arms strong across her shoulders. Outside, the night was still dangerous. The threat wasn't truly gone. But inside Sid, for the first time, Mara felt unbreakable. Not because she was safe, but because she had finally chosen to fight for herself and for a home that might one day truly be hers. Yet, as dawn crept across the frostbitten ranch, hoofbeats sounded again on the distant road, a new shadow looming on the horizon. What new danger waited for them with the rising sun? Dawn broke slowly, painting the snow-dusted prairie in pale gold. The air outside the battered house was sharp, alive with the distant echoes of last night's chaos. Mara stood by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the horizon. Her hands still trembled, but her eyes were clear. She hadn't slept. None of them had. But for the first time, exhaustion did not carry defeat. Caleb sat at the table, staring into his cooling coffee, while Annie tried to sweep up the broken glass and blood from the floor. Will was outside, hammering a makeshift brace across the ruined doorframe. The ranch looked battered, but it had survived, and so had they. But as the sun crested the ridge, a new set of hoofbeats echoed through the frozen air, measured, official. Mara's heart skipped. This was no angry mob. The sheriff's badge glinted in the morning light as he rode up with 2 deputies, guns holstered but hands ready, their horses stamped impatiently, nostrils steaming. Will met them outside, jaw set, dried blood crusted on his cheek. The sheriff dismounted, surveying the carnage. "Heard there was trouble," he said gruffly. "Ain't the first time Luther's raised hell. You all right?" Will just nodded, glancing back at Mara, who hovered uncertainly behind him. The sheriff's eyes landed on her, taking in the dark hair, the roundness of her face, the defiance in her posture. For a heartbeat, Mara feared rejection all over again. "But instead," he asked quietly, "you the one they came for?" Mara swallowed, then forced herself to speak. "Yes, sir, I am." He grunted. "Heard some ugly things about last night. That right? Luther and his men tried to drag you out? That you fought them off?" His tone was neutral, but his gaze was probing, searching for the lie, the weakness. Will spoke before Mara could answer. "She saved our lives." "Fought harder than anyone," Caleb added. "They would have killed her, maybe us too." The sheriff nodded, thoughtful. "Law's the law. Luther ain't above it. Neither are you." He glanced at Mara. "You hurt anybody?" Mara shook her head. "I defended myself. I defended my family." That word hung in the air, family. Annie squeezed her arm. The sheriff studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "We'll deal with Luther. He's got no more say here." "Not while I wear this star." He turned to his deputies. "Gather up what's left of that mob. If they're still on Will's land by midday, I want 'em in jail." Relief swept the room, mingled with disbelief. Will slumped against the porch rail, the fight draining out of him. Caleb exhaled, shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. Annie wiped her hands and sat beside Mara, eyes shining with a pride that didn't need words. But the sheriff wasn't finished. He fixed Mara with a steady look. "I'll be honest, miss. There'll be talk. Some folks'll say you don't belong here, that a fat girl has no place in a rancher's family. You ready for that?" Mara's chin lifted. "Let them talk. I know who I am now." He smiled, the first real warmth in his expression. "Good. That's all you'll need." With a final nod, he mounted up and rode away, deputies following. As they disappeared over the hill, Mara felt the weight of the night finally shift. The threat wasn't gone, but it no longer defined her. Inside, the family gathered. Will put a gentle hand on Mara's shoulder. "You saved us all. You belong here, if you want it." Mara nodded, emotion thick in her throat. Annie wrapped her arms around both of them, and Caleb placed his hand on Mara's. They worked through the day to repair the house, their movements slow but purposeful. Neighbors from the distant edge of the valley arrived, bringing bread, bandages, and awkward words of support. Some avoided Mara's eyes, but others offered shy smiles or quiet thanks. The tide was turning, slow but certain. As dusk fell, Mara stood in the doorway of her new home, looking out across the fields. The scars on her hands throbbed, but she did not hide them. She watched the horizon, knowing that trouble could always return, but so could hope. Caleb joined her, handing her a mug of steaming tea. "Never thought I'd see a day like this," he said. "Me neither," Mara replied softly. Behind them, Annie called, "Supper's ready." Will's laugh, warm, alive, floated out through the window. The house was battered but full, and for the first time Mara felt the truth in the sheriff's words. She had earned her place. She took a deep breath, feeling the cold night air fill her lungs, then stepped inside, closing the door behind her. But as the first stars prickled the sky, a shadow moved near the barn, a lone figure watching, waiting. The danger wasn't over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new judgments. But tonight, Mara was home, and she was ready for whatever came next. The night air was so clear Mara could hear the creek beyond the pasture, water slipping over stones, the distant call of a night bird. Lanterns burned low in the kitchen, where Annie and Caleb had finally fallen asleep at the table, their heads nestled together. Will lingered by the front door, eyes tracing the horizon, as if waiting for trouble to rear its head again. Mara moved quietly through the house, gathering her thoughts. In her hands, she held the letter from her tribe, the one that had arrived in court that morning, her mother's careful script, her father's memory like a shadow woven through the words. You may return, not as a burden, but as one who chose her own life. She traced the ink with trembling fingers, her heart torn between two worlds. All day, the question had burned inside her. Could she forgive what they'd done? Was blood stronger than the bonds she'd forged with sweat and courage and kindness out here on the ranch? Outside, frost gathered on the windowsill. The world was silent, suspended between yesterday's wounds and tomorrow's promise. Will's boots creaked on the porch as he stepped out, arms crossed against the chill. Can't sleep, he asked, voice low. Mara shook her head, joining him beneath the thin winter stars. For a long moment, they just breathed together, two silhouettes in the darkness, the ranch stretching around them, battered but whole. You thinking of going back? Will asked, not pressing, only wanting the truth. She looked down at the letter again, then out at the barn where the horses snorted softly, steam curling in the moonlight. I don't know. Part of me wants to see my mother again, to show them I survived. Will was quiet, considering. For you don't owe them anything, Mara. What you built here, it's yours. You saved us. Not just from Luther, but from ourselves. This place is your home, if you want it. Mara felt the sting of tears, but she did not let them fall. What if I'm always too much for both worlds? Too wild for my tribe, too different for this town? Will shook his head. You're not too much. Maybe you're just enough to change the story. A rustle in the dark caught their attention. Hoofbeats, soft, deliberate, approached from the edge of the property. Will moved instantly, shotgun in hand, but Mara caught his arm. Wait. From the shadows, a lone rider emerged. A woman, tall and broad-shouldered, her hair plaited in thick braids like Mara's own. The face was familiar, older now but unmistakable. Her mother. They stared at one another, words caught in the cold air. Mara's heart raced. Will stepped back, giving them space. Her mother dismounted, moving stiffly toward the porch. You grew strong, she said quietly, her voice uncertain but full of pride. Stronger than we knew. They were wrong to let you go. Anger flared in Mara's chest, but she kept her voice steady. You watched them sell me. You let them call me a curse. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. I was afraid. I thought it was better to survive, even if it meant breaking your heart. But you were right to run. You made a new life. The silence between them was raw but honest. Will lingered nearby, watching the reunion with guarded hope. After a moment, Mara said, I'm not the girl you left behind. I can't be what they wanted. Her mother nodded. Then be what you are. I didn't come to take you back. I came to see you, to say sorry, and to say, if you want, you can visit. On your terms. The tension in Mara's body eased, replaced by something softer, relief, and the beginnings of forgiveness. Behind them, the kitchen light flickered on. Annie peered through the glass, Caleb's sleepy face appearing behind her. The family Mara had chosen was here, awake, present, waiting for her decision. Mara turned back to Will, her voice clear at last. This is my home, but I will visit my mother. I'll let them see who I've become, not what they feared. Will smiled, pride shining in his eyes. Then we'll ride with you, if you want us. Mara nodded, her heart full of pain, of hope, of all the weight and wonder that comes from surviving and choosing again and again to belong. Her mother stepped forward and hugged her, not tight but steady. You are not alone, she whispered, for you never were. As dawn crept over the ranch, Mara stood between two worlds, no longer exiled, no longer ashamed. Her tribe had offered a door, but she had built her own house on the other side. For the first time, she knew belonging wasn't given or sold. It was earned every day by how you live, who you love, and the courage to keep riding forward, even when you don't know where the road ends. When spring finally crept across the high plains, it came not as a sudden miracle, but as a slow, patient victory. The frozen ground softened under the steady sun, and green shot through the dull brown grass. The horses shook out their winter coats and thundered across the pasture, hooves drumming a song that spoke of freedom and home. For Mara, it felt like the world itself was waking up after a long, hard sleep. The wounds from winter still lingered, on her skin, in her memories, but every day they faded a little more. She rode out at dawn with Annie and Caleb, teaching them to read the weather by the shape of the clouds, to listen for the warning calls of the red-winged blackbirds, to saddle a horse with patience and gentle hands. The children hung on her every word, faces bright with the thrill of learning something wild and real. Sometimes, Mara caught her own reflection in the water trough or in the kitchen window, and barely recognized the woman she saw, a woman strong enough to be both feared and loved, both wild and gentle. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, one built not on survival alone, but on something deeper: trust. Annie, once shy and hesitant, became bold in the saddle, racing Caleb across the fields. Caleb, once afraid of storms and strangers, found his courage working beside Mara, even when thunder shook the house. And Will, who had spent years holding his pain behind a wall of quiet, now laughed easily, his voice ringing clear in the evening air as he told stories at the dinner table. Sometimes Mara's mother came to visit. She brought gifts, baskets of herbs, beadwork stitched with care, old stories whispered by the fire. The first visits were awkward, full of silences that weighed more than words, but slowly, a bridge began to grow between them. Mara did not forget the pain of being sent away, but she allowed herself to see her mother's fear and love, how they had tangled and choked each other, how neither had been enough to save her, but both could still heal. When she rode back to the village with Annie and Caleb at her side, heads held high, she was not the girl they had cast out. She was a woman who had chosen her own story. The townsfolk, who had once whispered behind closed doors about the fat Indian girl the cowboy had bought, began to see something different too. They saw a woman who faced danger without flinching, who rode out in the dead of night to rescue a neighbor's lost cattle, who opened her table to any traveler in need. Some still clung to old prejudices, but most learned respect the only way that mattered, by watching how Mara lived. One evening, as dusk poured soft gold over the fields, Will found Mara sitting on the porch, Annie and Caleb playing tag in the yard. He sat beside her, silent for a while, then said, "You changed this place, not just the ranch, all of us." Mara smiled, quiet and sure. "You let me." He shook his head. "No, you made us let you. There's a difference." They sat together, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the wind move through the grass. Will took her hand, not as a question but as an answer. Mara leaned into his warmth, letting herself believe in this peace, this family she had chosen and built. Later, as the stars rose, Annie climbed onto Mara's lap and asked, "Were you scared when you came here?" Mara considered, then nodded. "Yes, I was scared. But being brave isn't never being afraid. It's choosing what matters, even when you are." Caleb's listening nearby asked, "Do you miss your old home?" Mara thought about the village, the faces that had judged her, the songs her mother still sang, the river where she had played as a child. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but this is my home now because I chose it, because you chose me." The children pressed close, and for a moment, the old ache of exile faded completely, replaced by something whole and healing. As summer bloomed, the ranch flourished. Mara's horses grew strong and fast. Will's fields ripened, the corn standing tall, the beans fat on the vine. Neighbors visited often, bringing gifts, laughter, and sometimes news from distant towns. People spoke of Mara as a legend now, not for how she looked, but for what she had done, for who she was. At harvest time, Mara hosted a feast beneath the wide sky, inviting everyone, tribe and townsfolk, wanderers and kin. The table stretched long and full, firelight dancing in every eye. When her mother arrived, she sat beside Mara, hand resting on hers, a quiet sign that the past did not have to define the future. As night deepened and music rose, Mara stood to thank everyone. Her voice was steady, her words simple. "We all belong somewhere, Sometimes you have to build that place yourself. But when you do, when you choose your family, your work, your home, no one can take it away. A hush fell, then applause, warm and real. Will joined her, arm around her shoulders. Annie and Caleb pressed close. And for the first time, Mara knew that no matter where she had come from or what the world had called her, she was home. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and share it with someone who needs hope, and watch our next video about the girl who tamed the Mustang everyone feared. Sometimes, the wildest hearts have the most to give.